The day the lawyer read my grandfather's will, everyone in the room laughed. Not polite laughter, not the embarrassed kind that people try to cover with their hands. This was the full, ugly sound of people who had been waiting to see someone fall and had finally gotten their wish. Four older girls from the dormitory crowded in the doorway of Mrs. Farnsworth's office parlor. One of them actually slapped the doorframe, she was laughing so hard. Her name was Patience, which was a joke in itself because she had never shown patience toward anything or anyone, least of all, me. The two trustees seated along the wall exchanged that tight adult smile, the one that pretends to be sympathetic but is really just cruelty wearing better clothes. I had seen that smile my whole life. I knew exactly what it meant. Even the lawyer from Union looked down at his papers like he was embarrassed to be reading the words aloud. His name was Mr. Pemberton, and he had traveled 12 miles on bad roads to deliver this news. 12 miles to tell a 16-year-old orphan that she had inherited exactly nothing worth having. Mrs. Cordelia Farnsworth stood nearest the stove because warmth in the Monroe Female Relief House belonged to rank. She controlled the heat the way she controlled everything else in that building, with absolute authority and no mercy. Her steel gray bun was pulled so tight that it seemed to drag all the kindness off her face. Maybe there had been kindness there once. Maybe years ago, before running a house full of unwanted girls had turned her heart to limestone. But if kindness had ever lived in Mrs. Farnsworth, it had died long before I arrived. When the laughter finally died down enough for her to speak, she folded the letter that Mr. Pemberton had handed her. She looked me dead in the eye with that expression I knew so well, that look of permanent, mild disgust. Like I was a stain on her floor that she couldn't quite scrub out. She said four words that would echo in my head for the rest of my life. "Well, Miss Colburn, your grandfather has left you a box of wind and a house built against a grave." I was 16 years old. I had been at the relief house since I was 11, when pneumonia took my mother one February after a timber chain crushed my father in a logging accident above Gap Mills. Before that, I had been passed around like a piece of furniture that nobody quite wanted, but nobody could throw away. 3 months with Uncle Vernon, who drank and sold my mother's wedding quilt for whiskey money. I watched him carry it out the door on a Tuesday morning, and I never saw it again. That quilt was the last thing that smelled like her. 7 months with the Bickles, who needed hands for milking and sent me away when they caught me reading by lantern light after dark. Mrs. Bickle said reading was vanity. She said a girl who read too much would never find a husband. She said I was wasting lamp oil that cost money, and money was something they did not have to waste on the likes of me. 4 months with the Cutlips, who returned me to the relief house because I argued that a leaking roof needed patching before prayer. I had pointed at the water staining the ceiling above the supper table. I had said that surely God would understand if we fixed the roof first and prayed second. Mr. Cutlip's face had gone red as a brick, and by the end of the week I was back on Mrs. Farnsworth's doorstep with my carpet bag in my hand. That was the pattern of my life, placed and replaced and returned, like damaged goods that nobody could quite find a use for. By the time I turned 16, I had stopped expecting anything different. I had stopped expecting anything at all. I had $1.32 to my name. I owned one spoon because every girl at the relief house was issued one spoon and nothing more. I owned 2 dresses, both gray, both patched. So many times they were more thread than original cloth. I owned a tin of needles that I had hidden under my mattress for 3 years. And I owned 3 books with their covers torn off. Books that I had stolen from donation bins over the years. Books that I read at night under my blanket, tilting the pages toward whatever moonlight came through the dormitory window. Books that would have gotten me switched if Mrs. Farnsworth had ever found them. She called my reading vanity. She called my questions impertinence. She called my habit of noticing things and remembering them a defect of character that no decent household would ever tolerate. And now my grandfather, a man I had never met, who had died 2 years earlier in a hollow 3 miles from nowhere, had left me his entire estate. 12 acres of rocky slope pressed against a limestone bluff. A cabin that everyone said was falling down. And a cave, a hole in the cliff face that local children called the White Lung because it breathed fog in summer and seemed to exhale in winter like something alive and waiting. The whole place was known in the nearest settlement, a village called Hollow Creek, as Colburn's Folly, because my grandfather had spent 30 years measuring that cave's breadth instead of raising proper crops like a sensible man. He had bought the tract in 1867 for $9. The auctioneer had laughed then too. $9 for land that could not be farmed, could not be timbered, could not be anything but a slow way to starve. 12 acres of nothing and a reputation for madness that had followed my grandfather to his grave. The trustees were already standing to leave. They had farms to return, to lives to live, better things to do than watch an orphan receive her worthless inheritance. The girls in the doorway were whispering to each other. Delighted, I could see it in their eyes. This was the final proof that Wren Colburn would never amount to anything. That the girl who read too much and asked too many questions had gotten exactly what she deserved. Nothing. Mrs. Farnsworth was watching me with that thin satisfaction she always wore when the world confirmed her lowest expectations. She had expected nothing good to come of me. And now here was the evidence. Here was my grandfather's joke from beyond the grave. But something was happening inside me that I could not explain. When the lawyer mentioned the cave, when he said the words "breathes in weather," something fired in my chest. Not hope exactly. I had given up on hope a long time ago. Something older than hope. Something that felt like recognition, though I had never seen the place and could not have explained what I was recognizing. It felt like a door had opened in a room I did not know I was standing in. I wanted to see a place that kept its own weather. I wanted to know why a man would spend 30 years measuring the breadth of a mountain. I wanted to know why everyone laughed at him and why he kept measuring anyway. Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat. He was packing up his papers, sliding them into a leather satchel that was cracked with age. He did not look at me as he spoke. The property is yours as of this reading, Miss Colburn. There's no one to contest. Your grandfather had no other living relatives. He paused. You'll need to take possession within 30 days or the county will assume abandonment and sell it for back taxes. How much are the back taxes? I asked. It was the first time I had spoken since the reading began. My voice sounded strange to me, thin but steady. Mr. Pemberton finally looked up. He seemed surprised that I could talk at all. $3.40, Bones. I had $1.32. The math was not difficult. If I did nothing, I would lose the only thing anyone had ever left me. And I would spend the rest of my days in this relief house, aging out at 18 into service somewhere scrubbing floors or washing clothes until I married someone desperate enough to take a girl with nothing. Or I could go. I could walk 3 miles down a road that ended at nothing. I could take possession of a falling down cabin and a hole in a cliff and 12 acres of rock that would not grow anything but questions. I could leave. The thought hit me like cold water. I could leave. Mrs. Farnsworth must have seen something change in my face because her expression shifted. The satisfaction faded. Something else took its place. Something that might have been concern, though I doubted she was capable of concern for anyone but herself. You're not actually considering going there, she said, to that place. I did not answer her. Miss Colburn, I am speaking to you. I looked at her. This woman who had controlled my life for 5 years, who had decided when I ate and when I slept and what I was allowed to read and think and say. This woman who stood by the stove because warmth belonged to rank and my rank was nothing. I have 30 days, I said. Her eyes narrowed. You have no money. You have no skills. You have nothing but the clothes on your back and a head full of books that will not keep you warm when the snow comes. She stepped closer to me. That place is 3 miles from the nearest neighbor. The cabin is falling down. Your grandfather died in that hollow alone and no one found him for a week. She let that sink in. If you go there, you will die there, just like he did. I should have been afraid. Any sensible person would have been afraid. But I had spent 5 years being afraid in this house. Afraid of Mrs. Farnsworth's punishments. Afraid of the older girls who took my bread and twisted my arm when the matrons were not looking. Afraid of the cold dormitory and the thin blankets and the endless gray sameness of days that led nowhere. I was tired of being afraid. Then I'll die somewhere that belongs to me, I said. The words came out before I could stop them. And once they were out, I could not take them back. I did not want to take them back. Mrs. Farnsworth's face went hard. Whatever concern had flickered there was gone now, replaced by something cold and final. Very well, Miss Colburn. If you insist on throwing your life away, I certainly cannot stop you. She turned to the lawyer. Mr. Pemberton, please note in your records that Miss Colburn has been advised against this course of action. Whatever happens to her is not the responsibility of this house. Mr. Pemberton nodded and made a note in his ledger. And just like that, it was decided. I would go. I left 4 days later, Mrs. Farnsworth did not try to stop me. I think she was relieved to be rid of one more mouth. One more girl who asked too many questions. One more problem that was no longer hers to solve. The other girls watched me pack my carpet bag. It did not take long. I had almost nothing to pack. My 2 dresses, my tin of needles, my 1 spoon, the 3 coverless books that I had hidden for years. $1.32 folded into a scrap of cloth and tucked into the bottom of the bag where no one would think to look. Patience stood in the dormitory doorway as I finished packing. She had that look on her face, the satisfied look of someone watching a rival fail. "You'll be back," she said. "A month, maybe 2. When it gets cold and you start to starve, you'll come crawling back here, and Mrs. Farnsworth will make you beg." I picked up my carpet bag. I walked past her without a word. I did not look back. The wagon driver's name was Horace, and he did not say much. He took me as far as the fork south of Union, then stopped his mules and pointed down a rutted track that disappeared into laurel and shadow. "Hollow Creek's 3 miles that way," he said. "Road gets worse before it ends." I climbed down from the wagon with my carpet bag. The mud sucked at my boots. The air smelled like pine and something underneath the pine, something mineral and cold. Horace looked at me the way people look at a buoy that has been left on the side of a road. There was pity in his eyes, but not enough pity to make him do anything about it. He did not offer to take me farther. He did not wish me well. He just clicked his tongue at his mules and drove away. I stood there in the mud for a long moment, watching the wagon disappear around the bend, listening to the creak of wheels fade into silence. Then I started walking. The road did get worse. Within a quarter mile, it narrowed from wagon ruts to a single rocky track. The kind of path made by feet and hooves rather than wheels. The kind of path that led to places nobody needed to reach in a hurry. The trees closed in around me. Tulip poplars and white oaks gave way to hemlock and rhododendron. The kind of growth that meant poor soil and steep ground. The kind of growth that meant I was leaving the world behind. I could hear water somewhere below me, trickling through limestone, running through channels I could not see. But the sound was muffled by the hollow, swallowed up the way a mouth swallows food. I walked for 2 hours. My carpet bag handle dug into my palm until I switched hands. Then it dug into that palm too. My boots were not made for walking this far on this kind of ground, and I could feel blisters forming on my heels. But I kept walking. The light was failing by the time I saw the bluff. It rose out of the hollow like a wall, pale gray limestone stained with rust where iron had leached through over centuries, topped with a fringe of scrub pine and laurel that clung to the rock like survivors clinging to wreckage. The bluff was maybe 60 feet high, not massive by mountain standards, but in that narrow hollow pressed between ridges on both sides, it felt like something that had been placed there deliberately, something that was watching. The cabin crouched at the base of the bluff like an animal that had given up. I stood in the yard and looked at it, and the looking took something out of me. The porch sagged away from the front wall at an angle that hurt to see. The boards were gray with age and rot, and some of them had gaps between them, wide enough to put my hand through. One shutter hung by a single strap hinge. The other shutter was missing entirely, leaving a dark window that stared at me like an empty eye socket. The roof showed gaps where shingles had blown off, and no one had replaced them. Years of weather had gotten in through those years of rain and snow and wind. The chimney leaned. The whole structure had the posture of a thing that had been waiting a long time to fall down and was surprised to still be standing. The yard was all nettles and shale flakes. No one had tended this ground in years, maybe decades. Weeds grew where vegetables should have grown. Brush encroached from the forest edge like an army slowly advancing. Someone had stacked firewood against the cabin wall a long time ago. The wood had gone silver with age and begun to collapse into itself, soft with rot, useless for burning. Mouse droppings darkened the doorstep, and underneath the smell of rot in weeds and old ash, there was something else. Something I could not name yet. Something cold and clean. Like air that had been stored somewhere deep and quiet for a very long time. I pushed open the cabin door. The hinges screamed. Inside was worse than outside. A single room, maybe 15 feet by 12. Smaller than the dormitory I had shared with 8 other girls. But this room was mine. That was the only thing I could say for it. An iron bedstead stood against one wall, its frame rusted, its rope support sagging. The straw-tick mattress had been colonized by mice years ago. I could see the holes they had chewed, the stuffing they had pulled out to make their nests. A table stood near the window, but one of its legs was shorter than the others. It tilted when I touched it. The wood was soft in places where water had gotten to it. A cast iron stove squatted in the corner, its pipe running up through the roof. But the stove plate was cracked. A split ran through the iron like a scar. That crack would leak smoke. I knew it without even lighting a fire. A single chair, a tin wash basin with a dent in the side. A cupboard with its door hanging open, revealing empty shelves and the dried droppings of animals that had lived here when no humans did. And folded on the bed with absurd neatness was a wool blanket, gray and worn thin at the edges, but clean. Folded with care by hands that had known this would be the last time. My grandfather had died orderly. That made it sadder. He had known he was dying. He had folded his blanket and straightened what could be straightened and waited for the end in this room that was falling apart around him. And no one had found him for a week. I set my carpet bag on the tilted table and stood there in the fading light, listening to the cabin creak in the wind. Outside, through the wamps in the walls, I could see the bluff, the pale limestone turning gold in the last of the sunset. And at the base of the bluff, half hidden by laurel and wind-thrown stone, I could see a darker shadow, a hole in the rock, a mouth, the cave, the white lung, the thing that breathed. I had come 3 miles down a road that ended at nothing to inherit a cabin that was falling down 12 acres that could not be plowed, and a hole in a cliff that children feared because it seemed alive. I was 16 years old. I had $1.32. I had no family anywhere in the world who would claim me. I sat down on the bed. The ropes creaked under my weight. The mattress smelled like mouse and old straw and something else underneath. Something like the memory of the man who had slept here for 30 years. I did not cry. I had stopped crying the year my mother died. Crying requires the belief that someone might hear you, that someone might come, that tears might change something. I had lost that belief a long time ago, but I did not sleep that night. I lay on that mouse-eaten mattress and listened to the wind come through the walls, listened to the cabin groan and settle in the dark. Listened to sounds I could not identify coming from the forest outside, and I thought about Mrs. Farnsworth's face when she read the will. A box of wind and a house built against a grave. She had been so certain that Ezekiel Colburn's inheritance was a final cruelty, a joke played on me by a dead man I had never met. And lying there in the dark, listening to my new home try to collapse around me, I thought she might be right. The next morning, I tried to make the place livable. I did not know what I was doing. I had never lived alone. I had never kept house. I had spent my whole life being told what to do and when to do it. But I learned. I stuffed rags into the gaps in the walls where the wind came through. I found rags in the cupboard, old shirt sleeves and trouser legs that my grandfather must have saved for this purpose. I pushed them into the cracks and felt the wind die down. Not completely, but enough. I swept out the mouse droppings with a bundle of hemlock branches. The needles were scratchy and the work was slow, but by mid-morning the floor was clearer. I could see the boards underneath. Some of them were rotted, some of them seemed sound. I found a tin bucket hanging by the door. It had one hole in the bottom, but I stuffed it with a twist of rag, and the hole mostly stopped leaking. I walked a quarter mile to a spring that ran thin and cold from between 2 rocks. The water tasted like iron and limestone, like drinking the mountain itself. But it was clean, and it was water, and it was mine. I filled the bucket, carried it back, set it on the stove to boil. The stove worked. Barely. Smoke leaked from the cracked plate, just as I had expected, but if I kept the fire small and the damper open, I could cook without choking. The trick was to stand by the door when the smoke got bad, to let the wind pull it out. I had brought a small sack of cornmeal from the relief house stores, taken without asking because Mrs. Farnsworth had never given me anything I did not take for myself. I mixed the cornmeal with spring water and cooked it into mush on the cracked stove and ate it with my one spoon. It was not enough. I knew it was not enough. The sack of cornmeal would last a week, maybe two, if I stretched it thin. And then what I had no money to buy more. No skill to grow food. No knowledge of how to survive in a place like this. But as I ate, scraping the last of the mush from the bottom of the pot, I noticed something. One of the floorboards near the bed sounded different. I had stepped on it that morning while sweeping. I had heard a hollow thunk instead of a solid creak, different from the other boards around it. Now with nothing else to do but survive, I got down on my knees and looked at it. The board was loose, not rotted loose, not warped by water or age, deliberately loose. Someone had pried it up and set it back without nailing it down. I worked my fingers under the edge. The board came up easily. Underneath was a cavity in the joist, a space between the floor and the ground below. And inside that space, lined with oilcloth to keep out the damp, was a package, wrapped so carefully it might have been a body. I lifted it out. My hands were shaking. I do not know why. Maybe it was the hunger. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the cold that had seeped into my bones during the night despite the wool blanket and the hemlock branches I had stuffed into the walls. Or maybe it was something else. Something about the care of this hiding place. The deliberate secrecy. The sense that someone had put this here for a reason and then made before he could explain what that reason was. I unwrapped the oilcloth. Inside were 14 ledger books, each about the size of a hymnal, each numbered on the spine in lamp black ink, 1 through 14. Some of them had swelled with damp over the years. The pages were warped, the covers soft. But others were still tight and dry, protected by the oilcloth and the careful wrapping. Underneath the books were 2 thermometers in wooden cases. The glass was intact. The mercury inside still moved when I tilted them. A brass compass with a cracked face. The needle still pointed north. And a tin of carpenter's pencils sharpened to points that were still usable. I picked up the first ledger. The spine said 1 in faded black ink. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small and cramped, the letters formed by someone who had learned to write in a schoolhouse a long time ago. But it was readable. It said, October 12th, 1867, arrived at Mercy Gap, purchased the tract at auction for $9. The auctioneer laughed when I paid. He said I had bought exactly $9 worth of nothing. I do not think he is wrong, but there is a cave here, and I have questions about caves. I sat on the floor of the cabin with that book in my hands and read until the light failed. His name was Ezekiel Colburn. He had been my grandfather, my mother's father, the man whose blood ran in my veins, whose name I carried, whose face I had never seen. I learned everything about him from those journals. He had been a schoolteacher once, in the valley before the war. He had taught children to read and write and cipher. He had been known for his patience and his strange habit of asking questions instead of giving answers. He had fought in the war. I do not know which side. He did not say, but he came back with something broken in him that made him want silence more than company, that made him seek out the empty places where no one would bother him. He had bought the Hollow Creek tract because it was cheap and far away from other people, and because he had read something about caves that made him curious. The first 5 journals were observations, 31 years of observations. He had measured the temperature inside the cave every morning and every evening, at the mouth, at 50 feet in, at 100 feet in. He had measured the outside temperature at the same times, dawn and dusk, summer and winter, year after year after year. He had noted the wind direction, the humidity, the phase of the moon. He had burned smoke pots at the cave mouth and watched which way the smoke went, inward or outward, fast or slow. And he had discovered something that nobody else in Monroe County knew, something that people would have laughed at if he had tried to explain. In summer, cool air flowed out of the cave during the day because the deep rock stayed cooler than the outside air. In winter, warmer air flowed out at night because the deep rock stayed warmer than the outside air. The cave breathed. It really breathed just like the children said. But it was not breathing because it was alive. It was not breathing because it was haunted or cursed or magical. It was breathing because of something else. He called it the mountain steadiness. He wrote about the stone's memory of other seasons. What he meant, though he did not have the words for it, was that deep in the limestone past the first chamber and into the passages beyond the rock held a temperature close to the yearly average. Summer did not heat it much. Winter did not cool it much. It just stayed the same. 52 degrees, 53 degrees, 54 degrees, year after year after year. The surface world rose and fell with the seasons, burning in July, freezing in February, wildly swinging between extremes that could kill you in a single night. But the deep rock did not care about seasons. The deep rock remembered an average. The deep rock stayed steady, and Ezekiel Colburn had spent 30 years wondering, what if you could borrow that steadiness? Journals 6 through 9 were maps. Hand-drawn cross-sections of the cave showing passages and chambers that went deeper into the bluff than I had imagined. Arrows showing airflow directions. Numbers showing temperatures at different depths. Smoke test results. Diagrams of how the cave connected to the outside through cracks and fissures in the rock face. He had explored every passage, crawled through spaces too small for most men, mapped everything he could reach, and speculated about what he could not. Journals 10 through 12 were construction plans. He had designed something. He called it a winter throat, an enclosed passage from the cabin to the cave mouth, sealed tight with doors at both ends and a baffle vent in between, a way to control the flow of air, to let the mountain's breath into the cabin when needed, to shut it out when not. The idea was simple but strange. Instead of trying to heat the cabin with fire alone burning through cords of wood every winter just to keep from freezing, he wanted to connect the cabin's air to the cave's air. Let the mountain's steadiness buffer the cabin against the killing cold of February. Let the stone do some of the work that wood and fire usually did alone. He had started building it. Journal 12 had sketches of stone footings laid at the cave mouth, measurements for lumber, notes about which boards from the porch would be the right length for the corridor walls. He had been dismantling his own porch to build the passage, and then he had died. Journal 13 was a winter log from 1894, the last full winter he had lived through. His handwriting was shakier in that one, the entries shorter. He was 73 years old, and he knew his time was running out. Journal 14 was personal, letters never sent. Notes to my mother Ruth, who had left the hollow and married a timberman and died before she could ever come back. And notes to me. I found the note to me on the third night, reading by the light of a tallow stub that was burning down too fast, my eyes straining in the dimness, my fingers numb from the cold. The words were at the top of a page near the end of the journal. To the child who still asks why. I do not know if you will ever come here. I do not know if you will ever read this. But if you do, I want you to know something. I was not crazy. I was just patient. The mountain keeps its own time. It does not hurry. It does not explain itself. It simply is what it is and has always been. Learn how to ask it, and it will answer. What the mountain keeps steady will keep you alive if you learn how to ask it. I sat on the floor of the cabin with that page in my hands. I cried. Not from sadness, from the shock of recognition. Someone like me had lived here. Someone who noticed things and remembered numbers and trusted observation more than other people's certainty. Someone who had been called crazy for 30 years because he paid attention to something nobody else thought worth measuring. Someone who had looked at this worthless place and seen a question worth spending his life on. And he had died alone. And nobody had found him for a week. And everybody in Hollow Creek had nodded and said they always knew he was touched in the head. But he had been right. I could feel it. In the cold air that moved differently near the door than it did near the back wall. In the way the cave breathed. In the data he had recorded over 31 years. Temperature after temperature. Reading after reading. Patient observation piled on patient observation until the pattern became undeniable. The mountain was steady. The surface was not. And somewhere between those two truths was a way to survive. I turned to the next page. There was another letter there, shorter than the first, the handwriting even shakier. March 4th, 1895. I have written to the Monroe Female Relief House. Ruth is gone. Her husband is gone. But I have learned that their daughter lives. Her name is Wren. She is 11 years old. I have sent $10 for her passage, train fare from Union to Gap Mills, wagon fare from Gap Mills to Hollow Creek. I have asked them to put her on the next train. I do not know if they will. I do not know if she will want to come. But she is my blood, Ruth's blood, the only family I have left in this world. I cannot finish the winter throat alone. My hands shake too much. My lungs cannot take the cold the way they used to. But perhaps she can finish it. Perhaps she will ask the same questions I asked. Perhaps the mountain will answer her the way it answered me. I stopped reading. I could not breathe. 5 years. He had written to the relief house 5 years ago, when I was 11. When I first arrived at Mrs. Farnsworth's door with my carpet bag and my mother's spoon and the grief that had no words, he had sent for me. He had sent money for my passage, $10, more than I had ever held in my life, and the letter had never come. The money had never arrived. Mrs. Farnsworth had never told me. For 5 years I had been an orphan with no one. For 5 years I had been passed from family to family, returned to the relief house, told that nobody wanted me, told that I would never amount to anything. And all that time there had been someone, here, in this hollow, waiting for me. I do not know how long I sat there. The tallow stub burned out. The dark came down. The cold crept in through the gaps I had stuffed with rags. And I understood something that I had not understood before. Mrs. Farnsworth had not lost that letter. Mrs. Farnsworth had not misplaced that money. Mrs. Farnsworth had taken them, kept them, hidden them away, because she had decided that a crazy old man in a hollow 3 miles from nowhere was no fit guardian for a child. Because she had decided that I was better off in her house under her control, learning her lessons about humility and obedience and knowing my place. Because she had decided, not me, her. My whole life had been shaped by her decision, and she had never told me. I did not scream. I did not throw things. I sat in the dark and let the knowledge settle into me like water sinking into soil. And then I made a decision of my own. I was not going to let them be right. Not Mrs. Farnsworth, not the trustees, not the girls who had laughed when the lawyer read the will, not the wagon driver who had looked at me like a boy left on the roadside. I was not going to die here. I was going to build what my grandfather had started. I was going to ask the mountain the questions he had asked. And I was going to find out if the mountain would answer me the way it had answered him. The walk to Hollow Creek took most of a morning, 3 miles on a road that barely deserved the name, past hollows and ridges and streams that had no bridges, through forests so thick the sunlight barely reached the ground. By the time I saw the first buildings, my boots were soaked and my legs were aching, and I had begun to understand why my grandfather had kept to himself. Hollow Creek was barely a town, a church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the west, a mercantile with a post office in the back, both housed in a building that needed new paint 20 years ago, a blacksmith shop that smelled of coal and hot iron, a small wool warehouse where farmers brought their fleeces in spring, maybe 40 houses scattered along the creek, 200 and some people who all knew each other and all knew exactly who I was before I opened my mouth. The mercantile was run by a woman named Opal Bratcher and her husband Clement, but it was Opal who stood behind the counter when I came in, a woman with a face like a hatchet and a voice that could cut through timber. She looked up when the door opened. She saw me. Her eyes went narrow. "You're the Colburn girl." It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "The one who inherited Ezekiel's place." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at me the way you look at a stray cat that has wandered into your barn, not with cruelty exactly, just with the certain knowledge that nothing good will come of it. "Folks say that cave breathes," she said, "cold in summer, warm in winter, ungodly either way." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. "Your granddaddy spent 30 years measuring that breath," she continued, 30 years carrying smoke pots into that hole, 30 years talking about heating a house with stone instead of fire. She shook her head. "People thought he was touched. I thought he was touched." She leaned forward, her hands flat on the counter. "You planning to live off that hole in the cliff, girl?" I looked at her, this woman who had known my grandfather, who had watched him walk into town for 30 years buying supplies, keeping to himself, going back to his hollow, to measure things that no one else thought worth measuring. "I'm planning to live," I said. She stared at me for a long moment. Then she laughed. A short, sharp sound. Not quite mocking, not quite kind. Well, we'll see about that. She sold me cornmeal and salt on credit. She wrote my name in a ledger and told me the debt would come due in spring. She did not wish me luck or offer advice or say anything that might be mistaken for encouragement. But she sold me the cornmeal. That was something. I walked the 3 miles back to the cabin with the supplies in my carpet bag and the weight of her certainty on my shoulders. Everyone in Hollow Creek knew that Ezekiel Colburn had been crazy. Everyone knew that his land was worthless. Everyone knew that a 16-year-old orphan girl with no family and no skills and no money was not going to survive a winter in a cabin that was falling down at the base of a cliff. I knew it too. That was the worst part. I knew they were probably right. But I had the journals, and I had nothing to lose. The first 2 weeks in that cabin nearly killed me. I do not say that for dramatic effect. I mean it literally. The cold and the hunger and the smoke and the isolation came closer to ending my life than anything I had ever faced. The cornmeal ran out faster than I expected because I was burning more fuel than I had, and burning fuel made me hungry. And being hungry made me burn more fuel trying to stay warm enough to think. A terrible cycle with no good exit. The spring ran thin in the cold. Each morning the water was harder to find, and I had to walk farther to fill my bucket. Ice filmed the surface of the pools where water collected, and I had to break through it with a stone. The stove's cracked plate leaked smoke into the cabin until my throat was raw and my eyes streamed constantly. Some mornings I woke up coughing so hard I thought I would be sick. Some nights I slept with my face near the gap under the door just to breathe clean air. I lost weight I did not have to lose. My dresses hung on me like sacks. My face in the wash basin water looked gaunt and strange. My own mother would not have recognized me. My hands cracked and bled from the cold and the water, and the constant work of hauling wood and cooking food and stuffing rags into gaps that the wind found anyway. I woke up at night shivering so hard my teeth hurt, and one morning I walked halfway to the road. I stood there in the frozen mud looking at the track that led back to Union, back to the relief house, back to Mrs. Farnsworth's pinched face and the dormitory beds and the girls who had laughed when the lawyer read the will. I could go back. I could tell them the place was uninhabitable. I could admit that Ezekiel Colburn had left me nothing but a slow way to die. Mrs. Farnsworth would take me in. She would have to. The county would not let a 16-year-old orphan freeze on the road, and she would spend the rest of my time there reminding me that she had been right, that the inheritance was a cruel joke, that I had been a fool to believe a box of wind could be anything but what it sounded like. Nothing. I stood on that road for a long time. The wind cut through my thin coat. The cold worked its way into my bones. My feet were numb in my wet boots. Then I turned around. I walked back to the cabin. I do not know exactly why. Maybe it was pride. Maybe pride was all I had left, and letting go of it would have meant letting go of everything. Maybe it was the memory of my mother, who had survived pneumonia for 2 winters before it finally took her, who had never complained even when she was too weak to stand, who had told me stories about her father in the mountains, the strange man who measured the breadth of caves. Maybe it was the note in Journal 14, the child who still asks why. I was still asking. I had not found the answer yet. That afternoon, I reread Journal 12, the construction plans for the winter throat. My grandfather had laid stone footings at the cave mouth before he died. He had measured the porch boards and found that 14 of them were the right length for the corridor walls. He had sketched a door frame and a baffle vent and a ceiling system using lime mortar and linen strips. He had done everything except build it. I walked outside. The porch was already falling down. Half the boards were loose. Some were missing entirely. But the ones that remained were exactly the right length. I stood there in the cold looking at those boards. Then I went back inside and got the hammer I had found in the cabin's single cupboard. A claw hammer with a worn wooden handle. The steel head was rusted but solid. I walked out to the porch. I stood on the sagging boards and looked at my feet. Then I started prying them up. I had no idea what I was doing. I was 16 years old. I weighed maybe 95 pounds after 2 weeks of not eating enough. I had never built anything more complicated than a corn husk doll. I did not know how to swing a hammer properly. I did not know how to set a post or mix mortar or frame a wall, but I had the journals, and I had nothing to lose. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard my grandfather's voice, the voice I had never heard in life, the voice that came through his words. Learn how to ask the mountain, and it will answer. I was still prying up boards when the old man appeared. He came out of the forest like he had grown there, like he was part of the laurel and the hemlock and the gray rock that showed through the soil. 70 years old if he was a day, maybe older. One eye clouded with cataract, the other bright and sharp. His hands were white in the creases, stained with something powdery. Lime. He was a stonemason, or had been once. He stood at the edge of the clearing and watched me for a long moment. I had not heard him approach. I had been too focused on the boards, too caught up in the work that I did not know how to do. But now I saw him, and my heart slammed against my ribs. Lime, he said, seeing me looking at his hands. I was a stonemason once. Name's Ephraim Stokes. I did not lower the hammer. Who are you? Just told you, Ephraim Stokes, lived down the hollow about a mile. He nodded toward the south. Been watching your smoke. Watching my smoke. Watching you tear down that porch. Watching you haul the boards over to the cave mouth. He walked toward me, not fast but steady, moving like a man whose body hurt but who had learned to ignore it. Watching you try to do something that takes two people with one person who doesn't know what she's doing. He stopped at the edge of the porch. What was left of the porch? He looked down at the stone footings I had uncovered near the cave mouth, the footings my grandfather had laid 3 years ago. Ezekiel laid those in 92, he said. I helped him with the lintel. He pointed at a flat stone set across the top of the cave mouth. I had not noticed it before, but now I could see that it was shaped. Deliberate. A frame for a door that had never been hung. You knew my grandfather. Played checkers with Jim on Sundays, when he'd come down from this hollow, which wasn't often. Ephraim Stokes looked at me with his one good eye. He talked about you, the granddaughter he'd never met, the one Ruth had before she died. My throat closed up. I did not know what to say. He sent for you, you know. The words hit me like a fist. Sent a letter to that relief house after Ruth passed. Asked them to put you on a train. Sent money for the fare. Ephraim Stokes shook his head slowly. I guess the letter never got there. I thought about Mrs. Farnsworth, her steel gray bun, her permanent expression of mild disgust, her certainty that she knew best about everything and everyone. I thought about 5 years in that house, 5 years of being told I was nothing, 5 years of waiting for something that had already been stolen from me. It got there, I said. It just never got to me. Ephraim looked at me for a long moment. Something passed across his face. Understanding, maybe. Or anger on my behalf. Or just the weariness of a man who had seen too much of what people did to each other. Then he looked at the boards lying in the dirt, the stone footings, the cave mouth with its lintel waiting for a door. You're trying to build his winter throat. I don't know what I'm trying to do. My voice cracked. I just know I'll die if I don't do something. He nodded, like that was a reasonable answer, like that was the only answer that mattered. Your granddaddy wasn't trying to heat a whole house like a furnace, he said. He was trying to borrow steadiness, let the mountain do some of the work. He bent down slowly, his joints cracking, and picked up one of the boards I had pried loose. You need frames first, vertical posts. Tie them together at the top, then nail the boards across horizontal. I don't know how to do that. I know. He straightened up the board in his hands, and for the first time since I had arrived in this hollow, someone looked at me like I might actually survive. That's why I'm here. Ephraim Stokes became my teacher. But he was not the kind of teacher who did the work for you. He was not the kind who held your hand or softened the lessons or pretended that failure was anything other than what it was. He came every morning for the first 2 weeks, walking the mile from his cabin in the early gray light, arriving before the sun cleared the ridge, carrying his tools in a leather satchel that was older than I was. A square with a brass edge worn smooth by decades of use, a level with a bubble that moved in oil, an auger for boring holes, a froe for splitting boards, a mallet with a head that had been replaced 3 times but never the handle, tools that had built things, tools that knew what they were for. He would set the satchel down on the stone footings that my grandfather had laid, and he would look at whatever I had done the day before, and he would tell me what I had done wrong. Not cruelly, not kindly, just factually. The way you might tell someone that water runs downhill or that fire needs air to burn. Post is out of plumb, he would say. See how the bubble sits, needs to be centered. Tear it out, do it again. And I would tear it out, and I would do it again. The first thing he taught me was how to split posts from poplar trunks. There was a stand of tulip poplars on the slope above the cabin, straight trees with pale bark and wood that split clean if you knew where to hit it. Ephraim walked me up there on the second day, moving slow, stopping, often to catch his breath. He pointed at a tree that had fallen in some storm years ago. The trunk was still sound, the bark peeling, but the wood beneath it solid. That one, he said, cut it into 8-foot lengths, then split each length into quarters. He showed me how to use the froe, how to set the blade along the grain and strike it with the mallet, how to read the wood for the lines that would let it come apart clean instead of splintering. He showed me once. Then he sat down on a stump and watched while I tried. The first length took me most of a day. My arms ached. My hands blistered. The froe slipped and gouged the wood in the wrong places. I ruined 2 sections before I got one that was usable. But by the end of that day, I had 4 posts. Rough and uneven and not as straight as they should have been. But 4 posts. Better tomorrow, Ephraim said. And he picked up his satchel and walked back down the hollow toward his cabin. That was how he taught. Show once. Watch. Correct. Move on. He never raised his voice. He never praised me for doing what I was supposed to do. He never told me I was doing well when I was not. But he kept coming back every morning. And that was its own kind of faith. The frame went up over 2 weeks. 8 posts sunk into the stone footings that my grandfather had laid. Each post set plumb with the level, each one braced against the bluff face on one side and freestanding on the other. Cross beams tied the posts together at the top. I notched them by hand with a chisel that Ephraim had brought, fitting each joint until it sat tight without nails. Nails rust, he told me. Joints last. Learn to cut a joint and you'll never need a nail. I learned to cut joints. My hands changed during those 2 weeks. The blisters broke and bled and then hardened into calluses. The calluses thickened until I could grip a saw without feeling it, until I could swing a mallet for hours without my palms tearing. My shoulders changed too, hauling posts up from the poplar stand, carrying boards from the dismantled porch, lifting cross beams into place and holding them while I drove the pegs. I had never been strong before. Strength was not something the relief house cultivated in its girls. We were meant to be useful, not powerful, obedient, not capable. But now I was becoming something else. I could carry 2 boards at once where before I could barely manage one. I could swing the mallet 20 times without stopping to rest. I could work from dawn to dark and wake the next morning ready to work again. I did not look like a girl anymore. I looked like a person who worked. Ephraim noticed the change. He did not comment on it directly. That was not his way. But one afternoon, watching me haul a post up from the hollow, he nodded to himself. Your granddaddy understood the cave, he said. Understood it better than anyone I ever met. He could read about something and know it in his head, but he couldn't make his hands do what his head knew. He paused, watching me set the post into its footing. That was his trouble. He understood the mountain. He just couldn't build the thing that would let him use it. But you could, I said. I could build, but I didn't understand. He smiled, or something close to it, a softening around his one good eye. Between the 2 of us, we had one complete person. We just never figured out how to share right. He looked at me, at my calloused hands and my strengthening shoulders and the sawdust in my hair. Maybe you got both halves. By the end of October, the frame looked like a skeleton of something that might one day be a corridor. 8 posts standing in 2 rows, 4 on each side, with cross beams connecting them at the top. The shape of a passage running from the cabin's front wall to the cave mouth. Then we started nailing the boards. This was where my ignorance showed worst. I did not know how to seal joints. I did not know how much gap was too much gap. I did not know how to hang a door that would actually close tight against the cold. Ephraim knew all of it, but his hands shook now. The cough that had always been there was getting worse. Some mornings he arrived with his handkerchief already spotted with something he tried to hide from me. So he sat on the stone footings and told me what to do. And I did it. Lime mortar, he said one afternoon. Lime and sand and water. I've got a kiln shed with some quicite left over from last year. Mix it right and it'll seal any crack you can stuff it into. He told me the proportions. 1 part lime to 3 parts sand. Water added slowly until the mixture was thick like porridge, but still wet enough to spread. He told me how to apply it. Thin layers, not thick. Let each layer dry before adding the next. Work it into the gaps with a flat stick, pressing hard to make sure it reached all the way through. He told me what would happen if I did it wrong. Too thick and it'll crack when it dries. Too thin and it won't seal. Too wet and it'll never set. Too dry and it'll crumble. I listened. I remembered. I did what he said, and by the first week of November, the corridor was finished. 20 feet long, 5 feet wide. Double doors at each end hung on iron hinges that Ephraim had brought from his shed. A baffle vent in the middle, a sliding panel that could control how much cave air flowed into the cabin. It looked solid. It felt solid. When I stood inside it and closed both doors, I could feel the air from the cave moving past me. 52 degrees. Steady and cool and utterly indifferent to the November wind that was beginning to bite outside. I thought I had done it. I thought the hard part was over. I was wrong. The first real cold snap came in late November. I woke in the dark to a sound I had never heard before. A high, thin whistling, like someone blowing across the mouth of a bottle. It was coming from the corridor. I got out of bed and walked to the corridor door. The cabin was cold, colder than it had been since I finished the walls. My breath made clouds in the air. I opened the door. The whistling got louder. And then I smelled smoke. Not the clean smoke of a wood fire. The thick, choking smoke of something burning wrong. The smoke that meant the air was moving in a direction it should not move. I ran to the stove. Smoke was pouring out of the cracked plate, but not going up the chimney the way it should. It was being pulled sideways toward the corridor door and then pushed back into the cabin by some cross-draft I did not understand. Within seconds, I could not breathe. I could not see. My eyes streamed and my lungs burned, and I stumbled toward where I thought the cabin door was crashing into the table, knocking over the chair, finally finding the door handle and throwing it open and falling out into the snow. I lay there on my hands and knees, coughing so hard I thought I would vomit. The cold air hit my lungs like ice water. My eyes would not stop streaming. And behind me, smoke poured out of the cabin door like the building itself was dying. I do not know how long I knelt there. Long enough for the worst of the coughing to pass. Long enough for my eyes to clear enough to see. Long enough for Ephraim to find me. He came out of the darkness like a ghost, moving slower than usual. Leaning on a walking stick I had not seen him use before. He looked at me kneeling in the snow. He looked at the smoke still trickling from the cabin door. He looked at the corridor, and I saw his eyes find the place where the whistling was coming from. A seam in the wall, where 2 boards met, where I had applied the lime mortar 2 weeks ago. The mortar had cracked. A gap had opened maybe half an inch wide, running the length of the seam. Cold air was streaming in through that gap, not from the cave, but from outside. And the cross-draft created by that incoming air was pulling the stove smoke backward, turning my cabin into a death trap. Ephraim walked to the seam and put his hand against it. He stood there for a long moment, feeling the cold air flowing in. Then he turned to look at me. "Too thick," he said. "Mortar cracked because it dried too fast on the outside but stayed wet underneath. I should have watched you closer." He shook his head slowly. "We'll have to strip it out and do it again. Thinner layers. Give each one time to cure before you add the next." I was still on my knees in the snow. My throat was raw. My eyes were burning. But I heard what he said. We. He had said we. Even though his hands shook too much to hold a trowel. Even though the walk from his cabin had left him leaning on a stick. Even though the cough that rattled in his chest was getting worse every week. He was not going to let me do this alone. I got to my feet. "Show me," I said. It took 3 days. 3 days of chipping out the cracked mortar with a chisel, cleaning the seams down to bare wood, mixing new mortar in smaller batches wetter than before. 3 days of applying thin layers and waiting, watching, testing each layer with my fingernail before adding the next. 3 days when the cold deepened outside and my food ran lower, and I thought about the road more than I should have. Ephraim came each morning and sat on a stump near the corridor wrapped in a blanket I had given him, telling me what to do and what not to do. His voice was weaker than it had been. The cough came more often, but he kept coming, and I kept working. On the fourth morning, I woke it before dawn. The cabin was cold, colder than it had been in weeks. I could see my breath in the gray light that filtered through the gaps in the shutters. I got out of bed and walked to the wash basin. The water was liquid. I stood there staring at it. Outside through the gaps in the shutters, I could see frost on the ground, frost on the dead grass, frost on the trees and the stones and the roof of the corridor, frost on everything. But the water in my basin was not frozen. Cold, yes, but liquid, moving when I touched it, alive. I walked to the corridor door. I could feel something different on that side of the cabin. Not warm exactly, but less cold. A presence of air that was not hostile. I opened the door. The corridor stretched away from me dim in the pre-dawn light. At the far end through the second door, I could see the black mouth of the cave. And flowing toward me, slow and steady, I could feel it. The mountain's breath. It was not warm, maybe 50 degrees, maybe 52. But compared to the air outside, compared to the killing cold that should have been seeping through my walls, it felt like something close to mercy. It felt like someone had left a door open to a gentler season. I walked into the corridor. The air wrapped around me. I put my hand on the wall and felt the stone footings beneath the boards, felt the mass of the bluff behind them, felt the weight of all that rock that had been holding this temperature since before I was born, since before my mother was born, since before my grandfather first measured it with his homemade thermometer and wrote the numbers down in a ledger that nobody believed. The mountain was steady. The mountain did not care about seasons. The mountain just was. I sat down on the corridor floor. I put my face in my hands, and I laughed once. And then I cried, and then I just sat there feeling the cave's breath move past me like a river of air that had been waiting all this time for someone to open the door. When Ephraim arrived that morning, I was still sitting there. He stood in the corridor doorway, leaning on his stick, looking at me with his one good eye. Then he looked at the thermometer he had hung on the wall weeks ago. Then he smiled. 53 degrees, he said. Your granddaddy was right. He was right all along. He walked into the corridor, moving slowly, his breath coming hard from the walk. He sat down beside me on the cold floor. You built it, he said. You finished what he started. I looked at him, this old man with his clouded eye and his hands white with lime, and his son buried under a quarry blast. This man who had come out of nowhere because he saw my smoke and remembered a friend who never finished anything. We built it, I said. He shook his head. I told you what to do, but you did it. Your hands, your work. He coughed, and I heard something wet in his chest. Ezekiel would have been proud. Your mother would have been proud. I did not answer. My eyes were stinging, and I told myself it was the cold. That first winter was a rehearsal. I did not know it then, but I was learning. Every day taught me something new about the system my grandfather had designed and I had built. The corridor was not magic. The cabin still got cold, especially at night, especially when the wind blew hard from the north. There were days when I wore every piece of clothing I owned and still shivered. There were nights when I woke with my teeth chattering and had to get up and pace the floor just to keep my blood moving. But it never got killing cold. It never got so cold that I had to choose between freezing and burning through my whole woodpile in a week. The families in Hollow Creek burned through cords of wood that winter. They hauled logs from the forest and split them and stacked them and burned them and hauled more. An endless cycle of work just to keep the cold from taking them. I burned a double handful of kindling each day, just enough to take the edge off, just enough to heat my cooking, just enough to make the difference between uncomfortable and unbearable. The cave did the rest. The mountain did the rest. Ephraim came most days, though the walk got harder for him as the cold deepened. His cough got worse. His hands shook when he held the level. Some days he arrived so exhausted from the mile-long walk that he had to sit for an hour before he could speak. But he kept coming, and together we refined the system. The baffle's the key, he told me one morning. We were adjusting the sliding panel in the middle of the corridor, the vent that controlled how much cave air could mix with cabin air. Too much flow and you cool the cabin down instead of warming it. Too little and you don't get the benefit. He showed me how to read the airflow, how to hold a candle near the baffle and watch which way the flame bent, how to adjust the opening inch by inch until the balance was right. You've got to find the sweet spot, he said, the place where the cave air takes the edge off but doesn't overwhelm. Every day's different. Every temperature's different. You've got to learn to feel it. I learned to read the corridor the way a sailor reads wind. I could feel when the outside temperature dropped by the way the cave air moved faster through the passage. I could tell when a storm was coming by the subtle shift in pressure that made the baffle creak. The mountain was talking. I just had to learn its language. Ephraim taught me other things too. How to bank a fire so it would last through the night without burning through all my wood. How to seal the cabin's remaining gaps with a mixture of clay and horsehair that would flex without cracking. How to read the sky for weather and the trees for wind direction. But he also taught me things that were not about building. One afternoon, while we were mixing mortar for a repair, he told me about his wife. Her name was Della. She had made the best apple butter in the county. She had laughed at his jokes even when they were not funny. She had stood beside him for 37 years through good times and bad, through the birth of their son and the years of watching him grow. And she had died the winter after their son died. Fever, Ephraim said, but he did not think it was really fever. He thought it was grief. Grief that had found a way into her body and settled there and refused to leave. After that, I didn't much see the point of anything, he said. He spread mortar on a seam with his trowel, smooth and even despite the tremor in his hands. I thought about walking into the quarry pit, just walking in and not walking out. It would have been easy. The pit was right there. The darkness was right there. He paused. What stopped you? I asked. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I realized that dying was easy. Living was the hard thing. And I'd spent my whole life doing hard things. He smoothed the mortar with the flat of the trowel. Seemed like a waste to quit at the end. He looked at me with his one good eye. Then I saw your smoke, saw you tearing down that porch. And I thought that's Ezekiel's granddaughter trying to finish what he started. And Ezekiel was my friend. And he never got to finish anything. He set down the trowel. So I'm helping you finish, because somebody should. Spring came late that year. The snow did not melt until mid-March and the mud lasted until May. But when the ground finally thawed, I started the work that my grandfather had never gotten to. The expansion. The corridor was 20 feet long. But my grandfather's journals talked about something bigger. A whole system of connected spaces, using the cave's deep chambers for storage, using the bluff's thermal mass for more than just buffering the cabin. He had dreamed of growing things underground, of keeping food through the winter without salt or smoke, of turning this worthless limestone hollow into something that could sustain a life. I did not have the lumber or the skill for all of that, but I could make the corridor better. I could widen it. I could add a small alcove in the cave for storage. I could make the doors seal tighter and the baffle work smoother. The work took all spring and most of summer. My hands, which had blistered and bled that first autumn, grew calluses so thick I could grip a saw without feeling it. My shoulders, which had screamed after every day of hauling boards, grew strong enough to carry two at once without thinking about it. I did not look like a girl anymore. I did not look like an orphan. I looked like a person who had built something. By the end of summer, the corridor was 5 feet wide instead of 4. I had built a small storage alcove just inside the cave mouth lined with flat stones to keep the damp away from whatever I stored there. And I had discovered something. The alcove stayed cool even in August. Not cold, not uncomfortable, but cool. 52 degrees, 53. The same temperature the cave held all year round. I stored potatoes there in July, root vegetables from the small garden I had managed to scratch out of the rocky soil near the cabin. In September, those potatoes were still firm. No eyes sprouting, no soft spots, no rot. The cave was keeping my food the way it kept its air. Steady, patient, indifferent to the seasons raging outside. I stored onions there in August. They lasted through October. I stored turnips and beets and anything else that would keep in cool, steady air. And it all lasted, weeks longer than it should have, months longer than the vegetables my neighbors stored in their root cellars. The mountain was keeping my food alive. The first time I brought vegetables to Hollow Creek, Opal Bratcher looked at me like I had grown a second head. She picked up a potato from the basket I had carried 3 miles on my back, turned it over in her hands, looked at the skin smooth and unblemished, pressed it with her thumb and felt the firmness. These came from your place. Yes, ma'am. From that cave? From the alcove I built inside it. She stared at me. It's September, she said. These look like they were dug last week. They were dug in July. I could see her trying to work out how I was lying, what trick I was playing. People in Hollow Creek knew that vegetables dug in July went soft or sprouted or rotted by September. That was just how things worked. That was the way that it had always been, but here I stood with a basket of firm potatoes in a story that made no sense. I'll give you 2 cents each for the potatoes, she said finally. 2 cents for the onions. It was not charity. It was not even kindness. It was just business. In business, Opal Bratcher understood. I took her money. I walked back to the hollow with coins in my pocket for the first time since I had arrived. 23 cents, more than I had earned in my entire life. Word spread. That is how small towns work. Someone tells someone who tells someone else, and within a week, everyone knows your business, whether you want them to or not. By October, people started coming to me instead of waiting for me to come to them. Asa Klein came first. He was a widower with 3 children and a farm that was always one bad season away from failing. A thin man with worried eyes and hands that never stopped moving. He stood in my yard with his hat in his hands, turning it around and around like he was afraid I might bite. Is it true, he asked, what they're saying in town, that you can keep vegetables fresh through the winter? It's true, so. The cave, the temperature stays the same year-round. Food doesn't rot as fast in cool, steady air. He looked at the corridor, at the bluff, at the black mouth of the cave beyond. I could see the suspicion in his face. The same suspicion I saw in everyone's face. The certainty that something must be wrong, that I must be lying or crazy or both. But behind the suspicion was something else. Desperation. The desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, the crazy Colburn girl had found something that actually worked. I've got more turnips than I can eat, he said. Lost half of them last year to rot. If you could store some through the winter, bring them by, I said. We'll split whatever survives. He came back 3 days later with a wagon full of turnips. By November, I had vegetables stored for half a dozen families, all of them paying me in shares or trade goods or the occasional coin. The cave was becoming a business. The worthless inheritance was becoming something else entirely. But not everyone was happy about it. Harlan Whitley came on a cold afternoon in November. He rode a gray horse with a silver bridle. His coat was wool thick and dark with brass buttons that caught the light. It probably cost more than everything I owned combined. He did not dismount. He just sat there on his horse, looking down at me, at the corridor, at the cave mouth beyond. Miss Colburn, his voice was smooth, polished, the voice of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. I've been hearing stories. I did not answer. People say you've got some kind of root cellar that keeps food fresh all winter. People say you're burning half the wood everyone else burns and staying just as warm. He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. People say your granddaddy wasn't as crazy as everyone thought. I looked up at him. This man on his gray horse with his expensive coat. This man who owned the wood yard in Hollow Creek, who held notes on half the farms in the valley, who made his living off other people's desperation. My grandfather was exactly as sane as everyone thought, I said. They just thought wrong. His smile flickered. I came to make you an offer. $12 for the tract. That's $3 more than Ezekiel paid for it. More than anyone else will give you. It's not for sale. Everything's for sale, Miss Colburn. It's just a question of price. He leaned forward in his saddle. This place isn't farmland. It isn't timber. It's a hole in a cliff in a cabin that's one bad storm away from falling down. Take the $12. Go somewhere with a future. I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had probably never built anything with his own hands, who had probably never spent a winter wondering if he would freeze before spring, who had probably never known what it felt like to have nothing and to turn that nothing into something through sheer, stubborn will. Mr. Whitley, I said, the last person who told me I had no future was Mrs. Cordelia Farnsworth of the Monroe Female Relief House. She said my grandfather had left me a box of wind and a house built against a grave. I gestured at the corridor, at the cave, at the bluff that rose behind it all. This is what that box of wind looks like, and I'm not selling it to you or anyone else. His face went hard. Winter's coming, Miss Colburn, real winter, not the gentle kind we had last year. When that cabin breaks and you're freezing in the dark, you'll wish you'd taken my $12. Maybe, I said, but I'll wish it from here, not from wherever $12 would have bought me a bed for a month. He turned his horse and rode away without another word. But I knew he would be back. Men like Harlan Whitley always came back. They could wait. They had time and money and patience. And people like me usually ran out of all three. But I wasn't going to run out. Not this time. The winter of 1897 was harder than the one before. The cold came earlier and stayed later. Snow piled against the cabin walls and drifted across the corridor entrance until I had to dig my way out each morning. But the system held. The corridor kept the cabin's air from plunging to killing temperatures. The cave kept my stored food fresh and my water from freezing solid. I burned wood, yes, a double handful of kindling most days. Enough to take the edge off, enough to heat my cooking. But families who had laughed at Ezekiel Colburn's rock garden were hauling wood every week just to stay alive. They were burning through their stockpiles by January, cutting green wood by February, burning furniture by March. I was hauling wood every few days, and I was staying comfortable. By February, people started coming to see. They came quietly at first, in ones and twos. Asa Klein brought his neighbor, Tom Harles. Tom Harles told his brother told his cousin told someone at church. By the end of the month, I had visitors almost every week. They stood in the corridor and felt the air moving past them. Warmer than outside, steadier than any stove could make it. They touched the walls and felt the temperature of the stone beneath the boards. They looked at me with something new in their eyes. Not belief, not yet, but the beginning of it. Ephraim watched all of this from his chair near the stove. He was weaker now. The walk from his cabin had become almost impossible. Most days he stayed with me, sleeping on a pallet I had made for him near the fire. His cough was constant. His handkerchief was always red when he pulled it away from his mouth. One evening after the last visitor had left, he called me over to where he sat. "Sit down," he said. "I need to tell you something." I sat on the floor beside his chair. "That cough," I said. "You should see a doctor. Doctors cost money, and they just tell me what I already know." He pulled out his handkerchief, looked at the red stains, folded it slowly and put it back in his pocket. "Quarry dust gets in your lungs and stays there. 30 years of breathing stone. The stone eventually wins." He looked at me with his one good eye. I had a son, good boy, strong, worked at the quarry up on Keeney Knob. His voice was quiet, steady, like he had told this story so many times it had worn smooth. There was a blast. Charge went wrong. Brought down half the face, he paused. My boy was under it. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say. My wife went the next winter. Fever, they said, but I think she just stopped wanting to live. He looked at the fire, at the flames flickering in the cracked stove. After that, I didn't much see the point of anything. Woke up every morning and wondered why I bothered. Went to sleep every night hoping I wouldn't wake up. He turned back to me. "Then I saw your smoke, saw you tearing down that porch, saw you hauling those boards to the cave mouth. And I thought that's Ezekiel's granddaughter trying to finish what he started." He reached out and put his hand on my shoulder. I could feel the tremor in his fingers, the weakness that had crept into him over the months. Ezekiel was my friend, the only real friend I had left, and he never got to finish anything. His whole life he understood things that nobody else understood, but he could never make them real. He squeezed my shoulder gently. "You made it real. You finished what he started, and I got to help." His eyes were wet, but he did not look away. "That's worth something. That's worth everything." I covered his hand with mine. "You're not going anywhere," I said. "Not yet." He smiled, that same soft, almost smile I had seen the first day he appeared in my clearing. "Not yet," he agreed, "but soon. The stone always wins." He coughed and I heard the rattle deep in his chest. When I go, there's something I want you to have. My cabin, my tools, the kiln shed with the quickite, everything I've got. It's not much, but it's yours. Don't talk like that. I'm talking like a man who knows what's coming. There's no shame in that. He leaned back in his chair. You were the daughter I should have had, Ren Colburn. You were the child I never got to raise. I sat there beside him, my hand on his hand, and I did not cry. I had learned not to cry, but something broke inside me anyway. Something that would take a long time to heal. Spring came. Ephraim got a little stronger when the cold released its grip. He started walking again, short distances at first, then longer. By May, he was making the trip between his cabin and mine most days. But he was not the man he had been. The cough never went away. The tremor in his hands never stopped. Some days he seemed almost like his old self, sharp-eyed and full of advice. Other days he sat in silence and stared at nothing, lost in memories I could not follow. I expanded the corridor that summer, made it 5 feet wide instead of 4, added braces to the walls, improved the baffle system so the airflow was smoother and easier to control. I built the storage alcove deeper into the cave, lined it with flat stones, made shelves from boards I split myself, and I discovered something new. The deeper chambers of the cave stayed even steadier than the entrance. 52 degrees in summer, 52 degrees in winter, month after month, year after year. My grandfather had measured it all, but I was the one who proved it. By autumn of 1898, I had vegetables stored for a dozen families. The cave had become the community root cellar that everyone needed and nobody had known was possible. People still called me the crazy Colburn girl, but now they said it differently. Now there was something in their voices that sounded almost like respect. Harlan Whitley came back in October. The same gray horse, the same expensive coat, the same smile that did not reach his eyes. Miss Colburn, I see you survived another winter. I did. And another summer of playing farmer in a place that can't grow anything. The cave grows plenty, just not the way you'd expect. He laughed, a short, sharp sound. I'll give you $15. Final offer. Take it or leave it. I'll leave it. His smile faded. You're making a mistake. A girl alone in a hollow like this, anything could happen. Anyone could happen by. I looked at him. Is that a threat, Mr. Whitley? He held up his hands. Just an observation. The world's a dangerous place for a woman with no protection. I have protection, I said. I have a roof that doesn't leak. I have walls that don't let in the wind. I have food that lasts through winter and a system that keeps me warm when everyone else is burning their furniture to stay alive. I stepped closer to him. What do you have, Mr. Whitley? A woodyard full of timber that people only buy when they're desperate. Notes on farms that only pay when families are suffering. A business that depends on other people's misery. His face went red. You watch yourself, girl. I have been watching myself for 2 years now, and I'll keep watching myself for as long as I live. I turned my back on him and walked toward the cabin. I'm done talking to you, Mr. Whitley. You can see yourself out. He did not say anything, but I heard his horse turn, heard the hooves on the frozen ground, heard him ride away, and I knew with absolute certainty that he would not come back. Not because he had given up, but because he had finally understood. I was not going anywhere. This place was mine, and no amount of money or threats or waiting would ever change that. The autumn deepened into winter. November came with its first hard frosts. December brought snow that stayed on the ground and did not melt. Ephraim spent more and more time at my cabin. The walk between his place and mine had become too much for him. Most nights he slept on the pallet near the stove, and I listened to his breathing and his coughing and the sounds of a body slowly giving up. But he was still Ephraim, still sharp when he wanted to be, still full of advice that I did not always want but always needed. One evening he called me over to his chair. There's something I never told you, he said. I sat down beside him. What? He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the fire, watching the flames dance. When Ezekiel sent that letter to the relief house, the one asking for you, he showed it to me before he sent it. I did not move. He asked me to read it, Make sure he'd said what he wanted to say. Make sure the words were right. Ephraim coughed, a long, rattling cough that shook his whole body. He talked about you like he already knew you, like you'd been here all along and he was just waiting for you to arrive. He said you had your mother's eyes, Ruth's eyes. He said you had his stubbornness even though he'd never met you. He looked at me. He knew, somehow he knew, that you were the one who would finish what he started. I felt tears prick at my eyes. But I never came. The letter never reached me. No, it didn't. Ephraim reached into his pocket, pulled something out, a piece of paper folded and refolded so many times the creases had worn soft. But he wrote another's one, just in case. A letter to give you if you ever did come. He held it out to me. I've been carrying it for 3 years, waiting for the right time. I took the letter. My hands were shaking. Open it, Ephraim said. It's yours. I unfolded the paper slowly, carefully, as if it might crumble in my hands. The handwriting was my grandfather's. That same small, cramped script I had come to know so well from his journals. To Ren. If you are reading this, then you have come. Despite everything. Despite the distance and the difficulty and the people who surely told you this place was worthless. You came anyway. I knew you would. I do not know what will happen next. I do not know if I will still be here when you arrive, or if I will have gone on to wherever we go when the body gives out. But I know this, you are my blood, Ruth's blood, the continuation of everything I tried to be and mostly failed at. What the mountain keeps steady will keep you alive. But more than that, it will teach you something that took me 30 years to learn. The surface of things is never the truth of things. The surface changes. The surface loss. The surface tells you that a hollow full of rocks is worthless and a man who measures drafts is crazy. But underneath the surface, there is something else. Something steady. Something true. Find it and you will find yourself. I love you, Ren. I have always loved you even before I knew your name. Your grandfather, Ezekiel Colburn. I sat there for a long time holding that letter. The fire crackled. The wind moaned outside. Ephraim's breathing rattled in the quiet, and somewhere deep in the bluff, the cave breathed, steady, patient, waiting for whatever came next. The warning came on the 2nd day of February 1899. I was splitting kindling behind the cabin when I heard the horse. The sound came through the trees like something wrong, too fast, too urgent, hooves pounding frozen ground in a rhythm that spoke of fear. I set down my hatchet and walked around to the front of the cabin. A man on a bay mare was coming up the track at a gallop. He rode like someone was chasing him, though there was nothing behind him but the empty forest. I recognized him as he got closer. Tobias Sykes, a trapper who lived somewhere up on the high ridges. I had seen him in Hollow Creek once or twice, trading furs for supplies. A solitary man with a beard that reached his chest and eyes that had seen too many winters alone. He pulled up his horse in front of the cabin. The mare was lathered, her breath coming in great white clouds that hung in the cold air. Tobias did not dismount. He looked at me with those winter eyes, and I saw something in them that made my stomach tighten. Fear. Not the small fear of a man who has made a mistake. Not the manageable fear of someone who knows how to fix what has gone wrong. This was the ancient fear. The kind that lives in the bones. The kind that knows something terrible is coming and cannot be stopped. There's weather coming, he said. His voice was hoarse, raw, like he had been shouting into the wind. Blue norther, skies gone wrong up on the ridge, pressure dropping like a stone. I've been trapping these mountains for 30 years, and I've never felt the air go this bad this fast. He looked past me at the cabin, at the corridor, at the cave mouth beyond. You're the Colburn girl, the one with the cave house. I am. Then you might be all right. He gathered his reins. Everyone else better pray they've got enough wood to burn for a month, because that's how long this one's going to last. I stepped toward him. How long do we have? He looked at the sky. The clouds were moving strangely up there, flowing from the north in patterns I had never seen before. 1 day, he said. Maybe less. The winter gave you 1 day, girl. Use it. He turned his horse and kicked it back into a gallop. I watched him disappear down the track. 1 day, I looked at the corridor. The outer section was not finished. The part that connected the cave mouth to a proper exterior entrance, the section I had been planning to complete in spring, was still incomplete. There were gaps in the boards, gaps in the mortar, places where the killing cold could pour through like water through a broken dam. If the storm was as bad as Tobias said, those gaps would destroy everything. The cave air would not matter. The mountain's steadiness would not matter. The cold would find those gaps and fill them and turn my cabin into a tomb. One day, I ran inside. Ephraim was sitting in his chair by the stove. He had been growing weaker all winter, but his eyes were still sharp. He saw my face and knew immediately that something was wrong. "What is it?" "Storm coming, bad one. Tobias Sykes just rode through. He says we have one day." Ephraim tried to stand. His legs shook. He grabbed the arm of the chair and pulled himself up. "The outer section," he said. "I know. It's not finished." "I know." He looked at me, that one good eye seeing everything. "Then we better get to work." I shook my head. "You can barely walk. You can barely breathe. You're not going out there." No, I walked to the cupboard where I kept my tools, pulled out the hammer, the bag of nails, the trowel and the bucket of mortar I had mixed last week. "You stay here. Keep the fire going. Keep the lamp lit. I'll need the light when it gets dark." He grabbed my arm as I passed. "You can't do this alone." I looked at him, this old man who had taught me everything I knew, who had come out of nowhere because he saw my smoke, who had given me the gift of his knowledge and his time and his faith. "I've done everything alone," I said, "my whole life. That's the only way I know how to do things." I pulled my arm free. "But I'll come back. I promise you that. I'll come back." I walked out into the cold. The light was already strange, not the gray of a normal winter sun. Something else, a yellowish cast to the sky that made the snow look wrong, made the trees look wrong, made everything look like it was holding its breath. I started working. The outer section of the corridor was a skeleton, a frame of posts with boards nailed across in some places and gaps in others. I had been meaning to finish it for months, but there had always been something else to do, something more urgent. Now there was nothing more urgent than this. I pulled boards from the pile I had stacked against the cabin wall, boards I had been saving for spring. Boards I had split and planed and set aside for the day when I would have time to do this properly. There was no time to do it properly now. I nailed the boards across the gaps, fast and rough, not caring if they were perfectly aligned or if the gaps between them were even. Just trying to close the openings before the sky fell. The wind started around noon. It came from the north like something that had been waiting. Not strong at first, just a steady push that made the trees creak and the loose boards rattle. But I could feel the temperature dropping, could feel the air changing around me. The yellow light was fading, replaced by something darker, something that pressed down on the hollow like a hand. I worked faster. My hands were numb inside my gloves. My face was raw from the cold, but I kept nailing, kept fitting boards into gaps, kept moving because stopping meant dying. By mid-afternoon, the wind was howling. It came in gusts that nearly knocked me off my feet. That tore the hammer from my grip and sent it spinning across the frozen ground. I chased it down and kept working. The temperature was falling so fast I could feel it changing between one breath and the next. 20 degrees colder than it had been that morning. 30 degrees colder. 40. The sky went dark. Not the darkness of evening, though evening was still hours away. The darkness of something coming, something massive, something that blocked out the sun itself. I looked up and saw the clouds. They were not like any clouds I had ever seen. They rolled across the sky like waves in a black ocean, tumbling over each other, swallowing everything in their path. I could hear the storm before I could see it. A roar from the north, like a train coming, like 1,000 trains coming. A sound that filled the hollow and bounced off the bluff and echoed in my bones. I had 3 boards left to nail. 2. 1. I drove the last nail home as the first blast of the real storm hit. The wind picked me up and threw me against the corridor wall. I grabbed the frame and held on as the world turned white. Snow filled the air, not falling but flying. Horizontal, a wall of ice and wind that hit like a fist. I could not see the cabin. I could not see the cabin. I could not see anything but white. I pulled myself hand over hand along the corridor frame, found the door, wrenched it open against the wind, fell inside. The door slammed shut behind me, and suddenly the roar was muffled, not gone. I could still hear the wind screaming outside, still feel the walls shaking with each gust. But inside the corridor, inside this space that my grandfather had dreamed and I had built, the world was different. I lay on the floor gasping. My lungs burned. My face felt like it had been scraped raw. My hands were shaking so badly I could not have held a nail if my life depended on it. But I was inside. I was alive. I crawled along the corridor floor to the cabin door, pushed it open. Ephraim was standing just inside holding the lamp. His face was white. His eyes were wide. "You made it," he said. "I made it." He helped me to my feet. We stood there together, listening to the storm rage outside. "Now we wait," he said. We waited. The storm lasted longer than anyone could have imagined. Not days, weeks. The cold came in waves, each one worse than the one before. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero, to 30 below, to numbers I did not know how to measure because my thermometer stopped working. The wind never stopped. It howled around the cabin like a living thing, found every crack I had not sealed, every gap I had not filled, every weakness in the walls I had built. But the corridor held, the section I had finished in those desperate hours held, and the cave kept breathing. 52 degrees, 53. That steady exhalation of air that was not warm, but was not killing cold either. I checked the thermometer in the cabin every morning. 44 degrees, 42, 41. Cold enough to see my breath, cold enough to need every blanket I owned, cold enough to keep the fire burning constantly, feeding it the small handfuls of kindling that were all I needed because the cave was doing the rest. But not killing cold. Not the cold that stopped hearts and froze blood and turned living things into statues. Outside, the world was dying. I learned this later when the storm finally broke and people could move again. But during those weeks, I knew nothing. I could only imagine what was happening in Hollow Creek and the farms beyond. I imagined the Bratcher family burning through their woodpile, burning faster and faster as the cold deepened, running out, starting to burn furniture, starting to burn anything that would catch fire. I imagined Asa Klein watching his children shiver, watching his livestock freeze, watching everything he had worked for disappear under a white blanket that would not lift. I imagined Mrs. Cordelia Farnsworth in the Monroe Female Relief House, that building that had never been warm even in summer. Imagine the girls in the dormitory huddled together. Imagine ice forming on the inside of the windows. I imagined all of it. And I sat in my cabin that was cold but not killing cold. And I waited. On the 18th day, the wind shifted. It had been steady from the north, brutal but predictable. Now it swirled. It came from every direction at once. It found seams in the corridor that I thought I had sealed. I woke in the darkness to that whistling sound, the same sound I had heard in November when the mortar cracked. But this was different, and this was not one seam. This was multiple places at once. The outer section, the part I had finished in those desperate hours before the storm was giving way. I got out of bed. Ephraim was asleep in his chair. His breathing was shallow. He had grown so weak over the past weeks that some mornings I had to check to make sure he was still alive. I did not wake him. I pulled on my coat, found my hammer, found the bag of rags I kept for stuffing gaps. I opened the corridor door and stepped inside. The cold hit me like a wall, not the steady cold of the cave air. Something else, something sharper, cutting through from outside. I could hear the whistling clearly now, could feel the draft cutting across the passage. I had to find the gaps, had to seal them, had to do it now in the dark, in the howling wind alone. I moved down the corridor with my hands on the walls, feeling for the cold spots, feeling for the places where the outside air was pouring in, found the first gap near the cave mouth, a seam that had opened between two boards. I stuffed rags into it, hammered them tight, found the second gap near the middle, another seam, more rags, more hammering. My hands were numb. I could barely grip the hammer, could barely feel the nails when I tried to pull them from my pocket. But I kept working, gap after gap, seam after seam. The wind screamed outside. The corridor shook with each gust. And somewhere in the darkness behind me, Ephraim slept and did not know that I was fighting for both our lives. I finished as the first gray light of dawn began to show through the cracks. I crawled back to the cabin door, fell inside, lay on the floor too exhausted to move, and looked at the thermometer on the wall. 41 degrees. The system had held. They started coming on the 20th day. The storm was not over, but there was a lull. A few hours when the wind dropped and the snow stopped falling, and people could move if they were desperate enough. And they were desperate. Opal Bratcher came first. She appeared out of the white wilderness like a ghost, carrying her youngest child wrapped in every quilt she owned, her face gaunt, her hands shaking, her eyes showing that ancient fear I had seen in Tobias Sykes. She stood in my yard swaying on her feet. "My husband's too proud to come," she said. Her voice was hoarse, cracked. "But my boy can't stop shivering. Please." I opened the door wider. "Bring him in." I did not remind her of what she had said at the mercantile that first day. I did not mention the word ungodly that she had used to describe my grandfather's work. I did not make her beg. She came back the next day with her neighbor. The day after that, 6 families came. By the end of the week, my cabin was full. People sleeping in the corridor, their bodies pressed together for warmth they did not need as badly as they thought. Children huddled in the storage alcove where the temperature never changed. Families who had laughed at the crazy Colburn girl, now sitting on my floor eating my food, breathing the cave air that was keeping them alive. I gave space to the Kleins. Asa and his 3 children, the youngest still too weak from the cold to walk. I gave space to the Harles family, June and her 2 daughters who had always been polite to me even when others were not. I gave space to the Bickles, the family who had sent me away 5 years ago for reading by lantern light. They came on the 23rd day, Mr. and Mrs. Bickle, and their 2 sons who had grown tall in the years since I had last seen them. Mrs. Bickle did not recognize me at first. When she did, she could not look at me. "You're the girl we had," she said, her voice small, ashamed, "the one who read too much." I looked at her, this woman who had called reading vanity, who had said I would never find a husband, who had sent me back to the relief house because I wasted lamp oil. "I'm the girl you sent away," I said. "And yes, I still read too much. That's why this place works." She flinched, but I stepped away and let her in, because cold does not care who was cruel. And I was not going to be colder than the weather. Ephraim watched all of this from his chair. He was too weak now to do much more than watch. The walk across the room exhausted him. Speaking more than a few words at a time left him breathless. But he saw everything. One evening when the cabin was full of sleeping families and the corridor was packed with people who had once laughed at my grandfather, he caught my eye. "They don't deserve it," he said. "Most of them." I was making soup, stretching the last of my stored vegetables to feed as many mouths as I could. "Maybe not. But you're helping them anyway." I stirred the pot. "Cold doesn't care who was cruel," I said, and I decided I wouldn't be colder than the weather. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Your granddaddy would have been proud of you. Your mother would have been proud." I did not answer. My eyes were stinging, and I told myself it was the smoke from the stove. She came on the 27th day. I did not recognize her at first. She was bundled in so many layers she could barely walk. Her face was hidden beneath a wool cap pulled low over her ears. Her hands were wrapped in rags. Her boots were held together with twine. She stood in my doorway with 2 girls behind her. Girls from the relief house. Girls I did not know. Girls who had replaced me in the dormitory after I left. "Miss Colburn?" That voice. Even after 3 years, I knew that voice. I looked closer at the face beneath the wool cap. Steel gray bun, hidden but not hidden. That expression of permanent mild disgust now softened by something else. Fear, maybe. Or exhaustion, or something I had never seen on that face before. Uncertainty. Mrs. Cordelia Farnsworth. The woman who had told me I had inherited a box of wind and a house built against a grave. The woman who had kept my grandfather's letter. The woman who had stolen 5 years of my life. She stood in my doorway and she could not meet my eyes. "I came to ask for shelter," she said, "for the girls." The cabin was silent behind me. Every family who had come for refuge was watching. Every person who had laughed at the crazy Colburn girl was listening. I stepped aside. Come in." She came inside. She stood in the middle of my cabin, surrounded by people, surrounded by the warmth of the cave air, surrounded by proof that everything she had believed about my grandfather was wrong. She looked around, at the corridor, at the cave mouth visible through the far door, at the thermometer on the wall showing 43 degrees while the world outside was frozen solid. "It works," she said. Her voice was small, wondering. "It actually works." "Yes. Your grandfather—" She stopped, swallowed, started again. "Your grandfather wrote to me after your mother died." The cabin went completely silent. Everyone was listening now. "He wanted me to send you to him. He sent money for your passage, $10 for train fare and wagon fare." She closed her eyes. "I kept the letter. I deposited the money in the house account. I never told you." I did not move. For 5 years, I said I thought I had no one. For 5 years, I was passed from family to family, returned to your house, told I would never amount to anything. I took a step toward her. And all that time there was someone, here, in this hollow, waiting for me. Mrs. Farnsworth nodded. Her eyes were still closed. Tears were leaking from beneath her lids. "I thought I was protecting you," she said. "From a mad old man, from a place that couldn't sustain life, from a future that I was certain would be worse than what you had with us." She opened her eyes and looked at me. "I see now that I was protecting myself, from looking foolish, from admitting that I might have been wrong." She reached into her coat with shaking hands, pulled out a yellowed envelope. The paper was soft with age. The ink faded, but I could still read the address. "To Miss Wren Colburn, care of the Monroe Female Relief House." "I kept it," she said, "all these years. I don't know why. Maybe I always knew this day would come." She held it out to me. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I kept you from him. I'm sorry he died alone. I'm sorry for everything." I took the letter. I did not open it. I already knew what it said. I had found the copy in my grandfather's journals. I had read his words 100 times. But this was the original, the letter he had written with his own hand, the letter that should have reached me 5 years ago. I looked at Mrs. Farnsworth, this woman who had controlled my life for so long, who had decided what was best for me without ever asking what I wanted, who had made choices that shaped my entire existence. I could have hated her. I had spent years hating her. But standing there in my cabin, surrounded by families who had come to me for refuge, holding the letter that had been stolen from me, I found that the hatred was gone. Not because she deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved to be free. "I forgive you," I said. She looked at me, tears streaming down her face. "Not because you chose well," I continued. "You didn't. You chose poorly. You chose out of fear and pride and the certainty that you knew better than everyone else." I tucked the letter into my pocket. "I forgive you because I will not let your choice become the shape of my life. I will not carry your decision like a weight around my neck for the rest of my days." I stepped back. "The girls can stay. You can stay too if you need to. There's room." There was not room. There was barely space to breathe. But I made room, because cold does not care who was cruel, and I was never going to be colder than the weather. The storm broke on the 3rd day of March. The clouds parted. The sun came out. The temperature rose from killing cold to merely bitter cold. And slowly, one by one, the families left. They walked out of my cabin into a world transformed. Snow covered everything. Drifts rose higher than houses. Trees had fallen. Fences had disappeared. But they were alive. They were alive because a 16-year-old orphan had inherited a box of wind. Some of them thanked me as they left, pressed coins or food or tools into my hands, payment for a debt they knew they could never fully repay. Some of them could not look me in the eye. Some of them said nothing at all. Harlan Whitley's sister came on the 5th day after the storm broke. She brought a bolt of cloth and a message. "My brother wanted you to have this," she said. "He wanted me to tell you he was wrong. About everything." She paused. "He's too proud to say it himself, but he wanted you to know." I took the cloth. "Tell him I said thank you." She nodded and left. I never saw Harlan Whitley again. Spring came slowly that year. The snow did not fully melt until late April. The mud lasted through May. The world took a long time to recover from what the winter had done. But people began to talk. They talked about the storm, about the cold, about the families who had died, and the livestock that had been lost, and the buildings that had collapsed under the weight of the snow. And they talked about me, about the crazy Colburn girl who had survived, who had built something in a worthless hollow that had saved dozens of lives. A professor came from Lewisburg in early summer. His name was Edmund Shaw, and he taught science at the academy there. He had heard about the cave house from a colleague whose cousin lived in Hollow Creek. He had traveled 30 miles on bad roads to see if the stories were true. I showed him everything. The corridor, the storage alcove, the baffle vent, the way the cave air flowed into the cabin and kept the temperature steady. I let him read my grandfather's journals, all 14 of them, the temperature measurements and the smoke tests and the airflow diagrams. He spent 3 days measuring, noting, sketching, asking questions that I did not always know how to answer. On the fourth day, he sat on the stone footings and looked at the whole system with something like wonder on his face. "This is remarkable," he said. "Your grandfather understood thermal mass and convective airflow better than engineers I've met. The principle is sound. The execution is elegant." He shook his head slowly. Why did no one know about this? Why did he die alone in this hollow while people a mile away were freezing? I looked at him. Because my grandfather was poor and strange and lived in a place that nobody visited. Because people would rather believe someone is crazy than admit they might have been wrong. Professor Shaw nodded. "I'd like to write about this," he said. "A paper for the academy, maybe a pamphlet explaining the principles, crediting your grandfather as the originator and you as the builder who proved it works." "Why?" He looked at me over his spectacles. "Because there are other hollows, Miss Colburn. Other families living in cabins pressed against limestone bluffs. Other people who might survive a hard winter if they knew what you know." He smiled. "And because I'm a teacher, teaching things is what I do." I said yes. What else was I going to say? By autumn of 1899, Professor Shaw's paper was being read in 3 counties. By the following summer, I had visitors from as far as Lewisburg and Hinton. People who wanted to see the cave house. People who wanted to understand how it worked. 3 years after the Great Storm, 6 families in Limestone Hollows had built their own versions of the corridor. 5 years later, the number was 20. 10 years after that, Professor Shaw told me that earth-sheltered housing was being discussed in university lectures as far away as Pennsylvania. That my grandfather's name was mentioned alongside engineers and architects who had spent their lives studying how to build. Ezekiel Colburn never lived to see any of it. But I lived, and I made sure the world knew his name. Ephraim Stokes died in the autumn of 1908. I found him in his chair on my porch. The one I had built for him after the storm. The one where he liked to sit in the afternoons watching the leaves turn on the ridge above the hollow. A bowl of bean soup sat on the table beside him, still warm. His hands were folded in his lap. His face was peaceful. He looked like a man who had simply paused between one breath and the next and decided not to take the next one. I sat beside him for a long time. I held his hand, the hand that had taught me how to build. The hand that was white in the creases from 30 years of working with lime. I did not cry. I had learned not to cry. But something broke inside me that day. Something that had been holding on for a long time. Something that finally let go. I buried him on the ridge above the bluff. The place where the morning sun strikes first. The place where you can see the hollow spread out below and the mountains rising in the distance. I planted mountain thyme on his grave, and I pressed his trowel into the soil. Handle first, blade pointing up toward the sky. Because a stonemason should be buried with his tools. He left me everything he had. His cabin, his mule, his kiln shed with the quick light still stacked against the wall. It was not much, but it was everything. He left me a letter too, just a few lines, written in a shaky hand that I knew so well. "You were the daughter I should have had. Build something." I married Gideon Harwood in the spring of 1904. He was a widower, a carpenter. He had come to Hollow Creek 3 years earlier looking for work. The first time I met him, he asked to see the corridor. Not because he was curious about the crazy Colburn girl, not because he wanted to see if the stories were true, but because he was a man who built things and he wanted to understand how this thing had been built. He spent 3 hours studying the joints, The framing, the way the boards were fitted together. He asked questions about the mortar and the baffle system and the principles behind the airflow. He never once asked about me, not until he had understood the building. Then he looked at me and said, "You did this yourself." "I had help. A man named Ephraim Stokes taught me." "But your hands did the work." "Yes," he nodded slowly. "Then you're the most remarkable woman I've ever met." He came back the next day, and the next, and the next. We were married that spring. We had 2 children, a son named Ezekiel after my grandfather, a daughter named Ruth after my mother. They grew up in the hollow. They learned to read the cave's breath the way their father read wood grain. They understood without being told that the mountain was alive in its own slow way. I trained apprentices over the years, young men and women who came to learn the principles that my grandfather had discovered and I had proven. I taught them what Ephraim had taught me, what my grandfather's journals had taught me. I showed them once, then I watched while they tried. When they got it wrong, I told them why. When they got it right, I nodded and moved on. I wrote letters to engineers and professors. I gave tours to visitors from universities I had never heard of. I answered questions from people who were building their own versions of the winter throat in hollows all across Appalachia. I grew old in the hollow that everyone had told me was worthless. By the time I could not climb the bluff anymore, my hands knew the cave the way a pianist knows a keyboard. Every seam, every joint, every change in airflow. I could tell the weather by the way the corridor breathed. I could feel seasons shifting in the temperature of the walls. My children thought I was strange. My grandchildren thought I was a character. But the hollow was still there. The cave was still there. The corridor was still there. Rebuilt and expanded and copied across half the county. Proof that a 16-year-old orphan with nothing but a carpetbag of stolen books had seen something that everyone else had missed. I died on a Tuesday in the spring of 1947. They found me sitting just inside the corridor door. My hand was on the latch, as if I had been checking the weather one last time, as if I had opened the door to feel the cave's breath and simply decided not to close it again. My daughter said I looked like I had simply paused between tasks. She said I looked peaceful. She said I looked like a woman who had finished her work. The cave still breathes. The corridor still holds. The families who learned from me and from my grandfather still use the principles he discovered in 1867. The stone still remembers the temperature of other seasons. The mountain still keeps steady what the surface cannot. On the wall of my cabin, in a frame my husband built, there is a page from Ezekiel Colburn's 14th journal. The handwriting is faded now. The paper is yellowed with age. But the words are still clear. What the mountain keeps steady will keep you alive if you learn how to ask it. Mrs. Farnsworth called it a box of wind and a house built against a grave. She was right about both. It was a box of wind. The wind just happened to be exactly what we needed. And it was built against a grave. The grave of everything I had been told I was worth. Every placement that failed. Every family that sent me back. Every voice that said a girl who read too much would never amount to anything. I buried all of that in this hollow, and I built something on top of it. I am asking you now, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever box of wind you have been laughed out of opening, what cave have you been standing outside of? What worthless inheritance have you been told to walk away from? What strange, dismissed, ungainly thing have you been afraid to claim because everyone around you said it was nothing? I was 16 when I walked into Hollow Creek with a carpetbag and $1.32. I had no skills, no family, no future anyone could see. I had been placed and replaced and returned like damaged goods. The only thing I had was a dead man's journals and the stubbornness to read them. And the thing everyone told me was worthless. The box of wind, the house against the grave, the rock and the cave and the hollow that could not be plowed. That worthless thing saved my life. It saved dozens of lives. It changed how people in 3 counties thought about winter and stone and survival. The conditions do not have to be perfect. They almost never are. The surface is the least interesting part of any piece of land and of any human being. What matters is what lies underneath. What matters is whether you are willing to dig. Your mountain may look like rock to everyone else. Learn how to ask it.